This is a lecture I am really looking forward to. It's as a part of a series of the lectures and conversations that we've been having post the ones on um, seeing land as common, seeing forest as common, seeing minerals as commons. Now we're getting into more exploratory conversations where some of the things like Paras had spoken about yesterday are the kinds of articulations and conceptions that we ourselves are having to do for the first time. We are thinking about many of these things the first time, though we might be involved in the heart of its work, but just in terms of conceptualizing it, we are doing it in a frame that's coming to us a little bit because of push of this course. So today we have with us Meera Sanghamitra, who is going to be having a conversation with us about looking at the relationship between gender and commons. Meera has been associated with the National Alliance of People's Movements for years. NAPM, for those of you who don't know, is a pan-Indian collective of mass movements of Adivasis, Dalits, farmers, fisher people, workers, and all other communities that are marginalized socially and economically. She's also been associated with the Narmada Bachao Andolan. Again, NBA is something that I know many of you are familiar with in this group. Meera has also been an active member of many women's rights and transgender movements and initiatives at the state and national level. She is part of the Telangana Hijra Intersex Transgender Samiti. I think most valuable for all of us, Meera has been a constant friend and ally to so many campaigns. With her compassionate support, her willingness to listen, engage, and draw connections between the diverse range of issues that movements and campaigns are constantly advocating and struggling with. Today, Meera is going to, like I mentioned, this lecture today is going to look at the relationship between gender and commons. It's some of the things that some of the questions, even when I was chatting with Meera yesterday, we were also thinking through what are the kinds of questions that hopefully, maybe if she's not able to address, maybe she gives rise to many more questions, which is still part of what we're all trying to do. Even looking at gender as a construct itself as a common, we all have a right to define and associate with the gender we wish to, going beyond traditional understandings of male, female, transgender. So the fact that this concept in itself is a commons, what has been the relevance of commons for people identifying with different gender groups? What has been the role of different gender groups in claiming and preserving different kinds of commons? These are some of the broad questions that we hope through this conversation. I don't want to put the burden on to Meera ki respond to all and give us answers to all of these questions, but I hope we can engage with many of them. And I hope that through this conversation, we also have more questions and we're able to think through all of this. So over to you, Meera, and really looking forward to hearing you speak.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Rakshita, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to all the students who've joined us today. I hope, although I know that there is a 1 hour slot for this presentation and then an interaction, but I'm not very sure if one would be able to engage for the full length of the 1 hour. I'll try to give some broad brushes of reflections that many of us have had through our experience of engagement with people's movements and struggles, and the kinds of issues that have emerged that we've encountered, have learned with from the struggling communities, especially at the intersections of gender, caste, and class. And then we definitely, as Rakshita says, might all have more questions and then collectively can think of, because this is an entire series about commons. So the collective spirit is what would help us to arrive at maybe more pathways towards what we all seek to move towards in terms of social transformation and social justice. I just wanted to start off with I was in fact thinking, how does one begin this conversation? And fairs actually immediately came to my mind. जब वो कहते हैं, it's basically in, it's not an English one, but I'll just mention it and also translate. He says, हम मेहनत कश जब जग वालों से अपना हिस्सा मांगेंगे तो एक खेत नहीं, एक देश नहीं, सारा जहां मांगेंगे. Which is when we, the struggling people, would seek our share, our right. We would not just seek or ask for one farm or one nation, but we would ask for the entire world. So looking at the earth itself as a common and connecting it to the lived experience of the struggling people, of working people, is what is the essence of what Faiz said. And I'm in fact just now coming back from 1 week in Jharkhand and coming back from the Friends of the Earth India chapter meeting, which we had, where of course, I mean, Jharkhand has always been a land of struggles of indigenous people, Adivasi communities in particular, and their relationship to commons has been so significant. And if you look at, for instance, even much prior to the 1857 first War of Independence, we've had Adivasi communities and the Adivasi leadership trying to assert not just their quote unquote right to commons as we are trying to articulate right now, but their sovereignty over their lands, over their regions, over their cultures, over their lifestyles. So from Sidhu Kanu to subsequently Birsa Munda to so many other Adivasi leaders who were part of communities who asserted the right of indigenous communities, Adivasis, Mulvasis, to land, to their Jal Jungle Zameen, I think is part of our extremely rich heritage when we speak of commons. And of course, there are so many dimensions and facets to the whole concept of commons. And it's actually heartening that this kind of both a series, a lecture series, which is part of the public policy course in NLSUI is being organized. And there's also an attempt which Rakshita, Khush, and many others are part of, and different organizations and groups are part of, to try and understand the different frameworks of the right to commons, and also build on it, on the basis of it, an accountability and justice framework. And rightly acknowledging the fact that there have been so many struggles over the years that have spoken about in different ways about commons, not just as an economic framework, because what we're increasingly seeing is everything in a capitalist society, especially in the last 2 centuries, being reduced to into economic frameworks. Am I audible?
Yes, very, very good.
So as against these kinds of economic frameworks, the worldview of commons as entire life systems is, I think, something that is very central to our understanding of commons, which is connected to people's cultural, everyday ways of life, which is not exploitative as against the current corporate and capitalist centric mode of development that we see. And this is where I think one would bring in gender, the understanding of gender and the function of patriarchy fundamentally, because the history of approach towards commons has been I mean, there probably wasn't that kind of a language, but it has been a feminist assertion over centuries. Whereas the history of exploitation, whether it is of natural resources, whether it is of labor, whether it is of various kinds of commons, is the history of patriarchy. So in many ways, we actually locate this entire understanding at the heart of this conversation when we speak of gender vis-a-vis commons. I was also thinking of, I mean, as Rakshita was mentioning, for many years, I lived in and worked with the people in the Narmada Valley, and learned so much from the communities over there, from the women over there, the landless communities, Adivasis, Dalits, fisher people, the boats community people, and these various categories of people who were dependent on the village commons, the village resources for their sustenance, and not only sustenance, but also deeply connected to their everyday life. So one thing that this one particular fisherwoman said, I just wanted to mention that it's extremely touching and also extremely political and philosophical. Her name is Sawa Jiji, and she comes from this village Pichhodi in Badwani district of Madhya Pradesh. I don't remember the exact time, but there was this some altercation with a senior officer of the Narmada Valley Development Authority, and then he was kind of being extremely derogatory to the fisher community people and mentioned, because there's also this reality. For instance, it has been a very long struggle in the history of Narmada Valley also. To, on the one hand, there is this larger uh, pattern of displacement and violation of rights of communities, and on the other hand, within that also, even when seemingly some rights are recognized, it is only for those categories of affected people or communities who have some quote unquote on paper relationship with resources. So for the land owning communities, those who have pattas, there is a certain kind of acknowledgement, at least on paper, for rehabilitation. But in the context of communities like the fisher people, it has been really a very difficult struggle. So narrating her relationship to the river, this is what Sawa Gigi says. She said, "Are Gigi," I'll just say it in Nimadi. She said, "Are Gigi, inki to," matlab she was talking to farmers. "Are inki to bas 5 एकड़ की अधिकार छे, मारी तो पूरे 1300 एकड़ नर्मदा नदी पर अधिकार छे." So she was basically saying that I actually own this 1300 kilometers of Narmada that flows from Amarkantak towards the Arabian Sea into Gujarat. So basically trying to say that the fisher people's relationship to the river is not, you cannot plot or actually divide their access to their commons through these small parcels of rehabilitation, but they actually relate to the river in so many different ways. So these are all, I mean, there are so many such anecdotes of how people have connected to the commons that have been so integral to their lives over years and centuries. But we've also seen and are experienced with multiple movements. I mean, Narmada is one of the movements I've been more actively associated with on a full-time basis. But in terms of, if one also looks at the history of various movements, be it the Chipko Andolan, where women had such a central role to protecting their access to forests, and also the manner in which trees were being cut down, or to the most recent example of RA, where the Adivasi women in the heart of Mumbai are also uh, trying to actually save their forests and the kind of relationship that they have with forests. So I think in terms of people's movements, there have been numerous examples. And just as I mentioned, Sawa Gigi, whose relationship with the Narmada River was so central to their life. I was in fact just last week listening to so many fisher community people, including some women activists whose primary relationship is with the oceans. And what they also narrated was something very similar, because what we are today seeing is a extremely exploitative model of development that is deeply patriarchal, and that is primarily centered around extraction of resources, extraction of I mean, materials from either from the earth or for sea for limited and short-term gains, whereas the people who are dependent on oceans have been looking at it as part of their whole matrix of life, and not only limited to particular profits that can be extracted out of ocean. In fact, going back to Narmada, I'm also reminded of this very interesting song, and I do think it is hugely relevant, because I mean the last two lines, it's about Narmada ki ghati mein ab ladai jari hai, and the last two lines actually say 50 साल के लिए पीढ़ियों का रोना है, which means for a development model which is so fleeting, so short term, for just 50 years, you are going to impact generations subsequently by exploiting these natural resources and by killing an entire river and the river ecosystem, which is part of the commons of so many communities, women being so central to all these, the way in which these commons are sustained and nurtured. So I think at the heart of all of this lies the capitalist mode of development, which is fundamentally patriarchal and exploitative in nature. One point that I would like to bring in at this juncture is how the whole question of labor and women's labor, and broadly, I mean, one can look at it in two categories. One is historically there has always, I mean, we all know how women's labor and labor itself is so gendered, and how women's labor has been exploited. I mean, you take any sphere of life or work, and how and it's not just underpayment, but also multiple ways in which women's labor is not valued, not recognized, not acknowledged, to not addressed, not I mean, even in terms of, when there are certain forms of quote unquote technological advancements, how women friendly practices, whether it is technology or women friendly practices, are not easily available. So this is one part of the whole uh, struggle. And then there is also I mean, yeah, just going back to fairs, because there's also this, I don't remember who said this, but there is this kahavat that was very prominent, basically saying कि if जब दुनिया की पूरी लूट का हिसाब लिया जाएगा, तो महिलाओं का जो लेबर का जो पूरा चोरी है या लूट है, दिस वुड फिगर, ये सबसे ऊपर चोरी के लिस्ट में सबसे ऊपर आएगा. सो व्हेन बेसिकली व्हेन one does the arithmetic of exploitation of women's labor, I mean, corruption in the whole world, the exploitation of women's labor would figure foremost. So this, I think, is also at the heart of our understanding of patriarchy and commons. But at the same time, I think it's also important to recognize, and since this is something that has, there's a history of whether it is feminist movements or other movements that have been trying to, in different ways, raise the question of women's labor and their relationship towards commons. And the other dimension to this, which I think is very important to understand in today's times, is how there is an appropriation of the very language of movements, the very language of articulation of gender and labor that feminists and other movements have been raising, and put it in a very neoliberal framework of gender mainstreaming, etc. And through this, so what is happening is, yes, of course, gender must be acknowledged and adequately valued. And this is something that struggles have been for the longest time articulating. But what is also becoming the mainstream reality of our times, especially with global finance and all these interventions, is there is a certain quote unquote gender mainstreaming without acknowledging the relationship that women and other marginalized genders have to the commons. And their relationship is not a framework of exploitation. Their relationship is a framework of sustenance, of nurturing. So the ask or the demand or the assertion for fairness in division of labor, for acknowledging labor, is part of the struggle to sustain commons. It is not an end in itself, where women are paid something while sustaining a larger framework that is exploitative of nature itself, that is exploitative of the very commons that they are dependent on, and would in the long term destroy their very life systems. So I think it's important to understand gender also in this framework, because there is a very severe attempt to in the garb of trying to also push for gender mainstreaming, continue a capitalist mode of development, which has been questioned and opposed for very long by different movements where women have played a very, very central and leading role. One example, for instance, is one can look at the whole history of the forest rights movement, and there has been a very significant trajectory of the entire forest rights movement. And broadly, in terms of while acknowledging historical injustice, the Act broadly provides two frameworks. One is individual forest rights, and then the community forest rights. And for the first time, interestingly, the IFR pattas also say that, the law says that the IFR patta should also have the name of women, which is of course very important. There have been multiple instances where this doesn't happen, and people have been raising these concerns, and all of this is at one level. And this is a very significant part of consequence of struggle that this kind of a legislation has come in place. The other component of the law is the CFR, the community forest rights. If one looks at in the past, I mean, from 2006 to 22, in the past 15 and a half years, the struggle to assert, the struggle to obtain recognition of CFR community forest rights has always been much more difficult, far and few, especially in places where there have been consistent struggles, where women and the local communities have organized effectively, where the administration is relatively a little sensitive, where there is a certain political will of the concerned state government, so on and so forth, have all been reasons that have led to some amount of recognition of CFR within the broader framework of the larger corporate and capitalist forces trying to push for, I mean, obviously not always directly, but in multiple indirect ways, push for the CFR rights not to be recognized. Because once the CFR rights are recognized, it is that much more difficult to undo that system. It is a furtherance of the acknowledgement of the right of the local communities, in which women play a very central role. So one also needs to look at how these kinds of frameworks, yes, a certain legislation has helped in women asserting their access to commons and their right to commons, but because even, I mean, laws are not I mean, either enacted or implemented in vacuum. They are within a broader framework of a capitalist mode of development. Therefore, even if you have certain enabling legislations, FRA is just one example, we have many such examples. Even if you have a certain enabling framework, the struggle to sustain such a law, which in a way asserts your right to commons, and which is so important for a formal recognition of women's access to commons, is made that much more difficult because of the constant pressure from multiple sides, and especially from the corporations. And we've seen this in numerous states. Ab Jharkhand le lo, Chhattisgarh le lo, take North Telangana, I mean, so many Andhra parts of, especially northern Andhra again. So there have been multiple places where women's access to commons is further compromised or violated, which is why one would think that there are two layers of struggle. One is at the level of the state. I mean, women have to always fight the state in their struggle to assert rights to commons, in their struggle to sustain their approach and their relationship towards commons. And at another level, which I think is very significant, and a lot of times we are somehow not able to adequately address, is the multiple layers of social conditioning, or the social, on the one hand, there is enormous social burden on women and other marginalized genders to labor and to produce certain forms of productive outputs out of their relationship with commons. But on the other hand, in terms of their access to or their rights to commons, the history or the trajectory of struggle to sustain such rights and then to participate in or be part of decisions when such rights are taken away, compromised, violated, is very difficult. Again, one small example, if you look at I mean, there are so many laws. You take, for instance, the Environment Protection Act and the subsequent notifications that were issued under the EPA, especially for the public hearing processes, EIA notifications, etc. If you look at, again, I'm just giving one example, but this is normally the history of any form of legislation where women are barely consulted in the process of making such sweeping legislative changes. And you look at, for instance, the practical aspects of, say, any public hearing, the entire structure of how a public hearing is conducted, the manner in which the information is generated, be it the EIA reports, the unintelligible way in which such information is, that too only after a struggle, put out in the public domain. It is not made accessible easily to the Gram Sabha, in a situation where already women's access to the Gram Sabha is not so easy because of various social realities. And then you have these public hearings where it is so difficult for women to come and participate, to assert what they what they feel, how they and since the entire framework is of the public hearing is to I mean it's a very it is not at an individual sorry, it's not at the village level where women from the affected communities can participate. It happens at a much higher level with basically bureaucrats and officials overseeing the entire process. So structurally, the example, the point that I'm trying to drive home is structurally the manner in which these kinds of uh, mechanisms are built within laws are so gender unfriendly, and therefore when there are attacks or when there are claims by the state in the garb of greater common good to uh, I mean, to further projects that are based on resource extraction or that take away people's rights to their commons, then the ability to or the space actually for affected communities, in particular women and marginalized genders, is that much more difficult and compromised. And of course, I mean, there has been in all of these examples that I'm talking about, if one looks at grassroots movements, there has always been an attempt on behalf of the local communities and the women in particular to hold authorities accountable, to make this information more accessible, to make sure that the women have say, right? And especially when the entire conversation or the process goes on in terms of, you know, what is your individual right, what is your individual stake, how are you going to be individually affected, right? So there is a constant contestation between the state trying to narrow down your locus vis-a-vis the affected communities, and in particular women trying to broaden the locus of saying that we as a community, or we as women who are related to these commons in multiple ways, would be affected. You can take any number of examples. I mean, the PH is public hearing is one example, but come to think of, for instance, in the urban context, hawking spaces, a lot of times, because, and also I think one needs to look at 93%, the broader framework of how 93% of unorganized workforce in the country is under the category of unorganized, or rather unprotected by law. And within this, an overwhelming section of the working class is women and marginalized genders. So you look at, I mean, take any sector. Right now, I'm mentioning specifically the example of hawking spaces, like say in urban areas, and how informal hawking spaces are a manifestation of commons. I mean, where else, if you don't have those common spaces as a matter of right, and that is so central to women's livelihood and sustenance in the context of urban and informal workforce. We've had, for instance, in India, legislation since 2014, which is also a consequence of a long struggle, which speaks of certain frameworks like, say, the wedding zones and the municipalities, etc., having to ensure that hawkers have certain rights to sell their wares. But you also see how there is, I mean, even post 2014, again in the last 8 years, you've seen a larger attack in terms of big retail coming into all these areas. You've seen how there is a consistent I mean, the state says the people, the women are encroaching on uh, public areas and commons, whereas it is actually the big corporations which have been encroaching on the livelihoods of the small sector, the marginalized communities, most of them who happen to be women. And again, within if you look at this category, again, caste and class play such a central role. Most of the women are either Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi. So these are spaces that people who are already marginalized should have access to as a matter of right. But you see how the state and the corporate forces have been encroaching. And again, here gender comes in as a major dimension of contestation between the state and the communities affected. Similarly, you take, for instance, in the rural context, and my experience has been more with Adivasi areas as well. And you see the same kind of, traditionally you've had so many heart bazaars where or small mandis. One can also very clearly see this contrast. For instance, the more formal sarkar recognized kisan mandis are where men have not that those are very great spaces doing justice to farmers, but you at least have a certain formal space where in those mandis where men have access, male farmers have access to sell their materials, their produce. Whereas most women who are small marginal farmers, I mean, many times not even recognized as farmers, and this is a much longer struggle. I mean, we've all been part of the Mahila Kisan Adhikar Manch, which has been a very important platform articulating the identity of women as farmers, the struggle to recognize women as farmers, and how women contribute 70% of labor to various levels of farming end to end. So within this context, if you take the example of mandis, I mean, the regular mandis are not spaces which are friendly or accessible to women for a whole set of reasons. And as against that, you have many of these informal, smaller marketplaces, haat bazaars, where women who are producing many times not the staple crops that where there is a certain mandated MSP, minimum support price, but crops which have no, I mean, for which the state has not put forth any value. So in the village heart bazaars or in the town places, many times they bring in their produce and sell in their different kinds of anaj produce. So these are also spaces that are commons, and there is increasingly an attack on these kinds of spaces as well, where women, whether from rural areas or from Adivasi areas, travel actually long distances to sell their produce. So I think there are numerous such examples of how women's labor, their access to common spaces or their access to other forms of commons is being compromised within a broader framework of a state which speaks of gender mainstreaming and gender, etc., but in effect is following modes of development which are rooted in patriarchy, which are deeply violent, and therefore are not friendly either for women or for various marginalized genders. I am reminded of a small, it's a small initiative, but I think a very important one in Tamil Nadu. There's this small group of trans women who started an initiative of cooperative farming. This is something that so many of us, both in the broader women's movement and also as part of Makam and elsewhere, have been asserting of the value of cooperative farming as something that would be very significant in the context of the climate crisis that we are facing, in the context of lack of land, in the context of the fact that various support systems that should be provided to women farmers are not provided. Therefore, collective and cooperative farming is something that would provide a very significant support system to women from rural areas. So there is this small community of trans women in Tamil Nadu, in Thoothukudi district, who've struggled quite a bit and have got the district collector of Thoothukudi to actually recognize their rights to collective farming. So this is again another small but very significant example of trans women who have asserted their rights to commons. The understanding and I think the relationship of marginalized genders to commons is a very complex subject, to be honest. And I think one cannot speak of this without speaking of how the assertion of gender itself is not individual alone, but the experience of gender oppression, especially by those whose gender doesn't fit into the mainstream bracket, has been to find liberation through collective spaces of solidarity. And this has been, for instance, if one looks at it in the Indian and in the South Asian context, the either the Hijra system or the Gharana system, of course, I mean, it is not entirely how does one say, free of its limitations or critique, but it has been a very important space of collective assertion in the background of individuals whose gender does not fit in, to find some space for their assertion, and therefore collective ways of living together, collective ways of sustaining their livelihoods, etc. So there are multiple such instances of either women or persons from different genders trying to assert their relationship to commons, their response to mainstream systems or approaches uh, that does not speak to their lived experiences, and within a reality where we are increasingly seeing that there is a push for individualization, there is a push for certain patriarchal modes of development, these struggles are only becoming that much more difficult and hard to actually fight for. But I think there are also newer ways and newer imaginations of the feminist movement, of other people's movements, where women, where trans people, where queer people are trying to bring in their imaginations. It is not being easy, but we do see that through multiple ongoing efforts, and we hope that these kinds of conversations around commons, and for instance, those of us who come from the feminist movements think of the anti-feminist movement in India itself as a huge common, or the broader people's movements in India itself as a huge commons. I mean, it's a common resource or a common legacy that all of us can learn from, build on, although there are many contestations, whether in relation to our understanding of labor, in relation to our understanding of caste. I mean, we are still so far away in terms of understanding how caste plays such a, I mean, central role in actually making the relationship of women or marginalized genders that much more difficult to assert their relationship to commons, whereas they have, I mean, historically been guardians of many of these commons. Whether you look at, for instance, I again remember in multiple places the access to rivers which serve many purposes, which serve as sites for fishing, which serve as sites for farming, as a water source, which serve as sites as dhobi ghats, no, where collectively the washing is done. So all of these are sites where there is a certain relationship to the economic life of the village, and there is also a broader social connection with the resource. So the entire feminist worldview of commons is far beyond looking at commons as an economic resource, but looking at it as very central to the experiences of women, whether it is in terms of recognizing their labor, but going beyond that to sustain the commons itself, especially in a context of climate crisis and the ecological struggles and crisis that we are in today. And therefore, one does think that there is a huge role that our shared feminist struggles, be it of the anti-caste feminist struggles, be it of the feminist assertions from the labor movement, be it of the trans and queer movements which are trying to bring in their own rainbow of resistance experiences, can all feed into a collective understanding of what actually commons can really mean at a time when we are facing intense corporate onslaught. I think I'll stop here and